Welcome to everyone joining us, hopefully again here on Thursday. We had a webinar just yesterday, and so 2 in a row is a busy week for us. So I hope you're joining us again, and if not, welcome. For the first time, we're really excited to have a super interesting panel here. We have called this particular webinar Chaplaincy Beyond Tradition, which to be honest is just sort of a made-up term. But I think you will understand why we came up with that when we hear a little bit more about the work that these women are doing. So let me introduce them briefly. I'm just going to do it in the order that you appear on my Zoom screen, and we'll go from there. So the first here is the Reverend LeSette Wright, who is college chaplain at Berea College. And that is either in Berea, Kentucky or near Richmond, right?
Yes, both.
All right. Well, I know as much to say that if you can find Lexington on the map, you can probably find Berea too. So
yeah,
down in that part of the country. Next is Reverend Laura Everett, who is the executive director of the Massachusetts Council of Churches. But more importantly for us today, she is also chaplain to the cycling community. And so we're really excited to hear about that as well. And then finally on my screen, chaplain number 3 is Reverend Ann Kansfield, who is chaplain to the New York Fire Department. So welcome all 3 of you. What I just said about all of you is just sort of the very, very superficial level of what you do. And so let me just start by asking LeSette, again, you're first on my screen. So let me ask, how did you end up doing what you're doing? Because I'm interesting path there, and so that's going to be an eye-opener for all of us.
I do, and so I'm going to try to just keep this brief because I can talk a lot. Hi, everyone. It's my joy to be here. If you hear some noise in the background that sounds like construction is happening, it's because we're building a residence hall on campus. So my professional journey has included the fields of mental health, public health, and practical theology. And so my view of chaplaincy encompasses all of these disciplines. I engage from a framework that sees whole people, whole communities, systemic influences, and the impact of those. And that's really how my brain is working at all times. I'm a trained mental health clinician and public health advisor, specifically in the areas of youth violence prevention. And so I bring all of that into my chaplaincy service. I've worked as a local church youth minister, and I've also served as a community and disaster response chaplain with survivors of Columbine, Sandy Hook, the Parkland, Stoneman Douglas High School shooting, as well as the Boston Marathon bombing. So I've spent the majority of my career working with marginalized populations. As mentioned, I currently serve as the college chaplain here at Berea College in Kentucky. And as I said, I come to the work through those interdisciplinary lenses and experiences in my current work as a college chaplain.
That's great, and you rest assured we're going to follow up on many of those points as we move on. Laura, tell us how you ended up doing what you're doing.
Happily. Hi, folks. I'm Laura Everett. I'm coming to you live from Boston, Massachusetts, where I'm a pastor. I'm ordained in the United Church of Christ, and my full-time ministry is as the executive director of the Massachusetts Council of Churches, which we initially didn't think of as having a chaplaincy function, but what I've learned over the past 14 years that I've been in this ministry is that part of what I do is chaplain the bishops and the heads of church and the denominational staff and the camp and conference directors and local church pastors who are trying to work well with one another. But I think the reason why I've been in this conversation as a chaplain is about 6 years ago, I started on a journey becoming something of an informal cycling chaplain. I ride my bicycle as my primary mode of transit in Boston. My car died when I was recently out of seminary and had a lot of debt, and I didn't have money to replace it. And the women in my Bible study taught me how to ride a bicycle and repaired one for me. And so since then, I've been a 4-season bike commuter. Unfortunately, cyclists, women and people of color are vulnerable transit users, and that means that the violence in our world shows up on our streets. The cycling community has developed, and I'm part of developing some more rituals around care after a crash. 6 years ago, another cyclist who knew I was a pastor said we were going to gather to dedicate a ghost bike for a woman named Marcia Deal. We got to the corner where she was killed, riding her bicycle, and this other cyclist, his name is Peter, turned to me and said, "You're a pastor, what do we do?" And as it turns out, no prayer book, nothing I had done in seminary, no liturgy had existed for a dedication of a ghost bike. I'm now 6 years and probably 24 ghost bike dedications later, having learned and built community ritual with a group of people who do not believe the same thing, do not think the same thing, do not express their religious convictions the same way. I've done 4 different weddings of cyclists. This is not where I thought my ministry would be, but it's very, very good. And I'm gonna throw a link into the chat function about a recent fatality so you get a sense of what a ghost bike ceremony is like.
Thank you. And Ann, that leaves you.
So I'm Ann Kansfield. Similarly to my friend Laura, I am also bivocational in my chaplaincy. I've been the pastor of the Greenpoint Reformed Church in Brooklyn for the last 15.5 years. And then I've served in the fire department in the city of New York as a fire department chaplain for the last 4 years. The question was, how did I get started with this, I guess?
Yeah.
So when I graduated from college, ended up working as a stockbroker, and part of that time was for a company that was located in Two World Trade. While I had left that job before 9/11 happened, it was a very significant event in my life, definitely precipitating going to seminary and entering ministry. And in the reporting about 9/11, I came to know about Michael Judge, who's just a phenomenal role model and mentor. And like through his life, I discovered like, oh, the fire department has chaplains. Well, I would really love that job. That sounds like it would be like totally my jam. Never having actually believed that I would be able to have the gift of getting to actually serve in the fire department in this way. So it just happened that 4 years ago, there was a new mayor. He was wanted to be very intentional about diversifying the people who served in the fire department. And because of the way that civil service operates, it was far easier to make where the fire commissioner could make appointments. That was a very immediate way to bring diversity. And so they very intentionally looked for a woman. So I'm the first woman to go and serve the fire department as chaplain.
You know, what strikes me is that hearing about all of your backgrounds, there is this blend of, if you had followed one trajectory, you would have really been, you know, in sort of traditional congregational ministry, and yet here you are. You know, how divergent are those paths, or do they really inform one another? This is something that I think a lot of people who are either at the beginning of a career as a chaplain or who are maybe discerning a vocation to more traditional ministry, these are questions that they have. And so tell us what that looks like. What is the difference between what you're doing now and being in a congregation or a parish week in and week out?
So I would say in my context, they're actually really quite similar. It's just the size and scale that's different. I joke that when I when I came on the job in the fire department, I suddenly had a mega church. So I get to serve an incredibly broad range of people. I think there are probably 18,000 members of the fire department that get to sort of make up my parish, and it's kind of similar to my local parish in that when I was called to Greenpoint, there were not a lot of Protestants in the neighborhood. Everything had changed. There were not a lot of people who would look like traditional, like church-going types, and the community in which I serve is very heavily Polish and very heavily Catholic, which really prepared me very well for the fire department, where it's predominantly still very Catholic, and in New York also, like there are many ways in which it could look religious, though not, I would say, with a like specific religious mandate. But so it's a type of ministry where I can't assume anybody is going to be the same as anybody else. It's very not like the type of parish community that I grew up in, where I could assume that everybody pretty much shared similar religious views, ethnic backgrounds, and sort of ways of being. So I'm really grateful both for the parish experience that I have and for the ways that the two can inform each other.
And LeSette, I could tell you were trying to talk a minute ago, but you were muted. So let's have you chime in.
Yeah, I was fighting with my mute. Excuse me, I'll get the hang of it. And so, for me, I think, my experience in the local church, once again, I have to go back to my introduction. So I bring all of those aspects of me with me in whatever capacity I serve in. So as a local church youth minister that really worked with a parish that was diverse in its, it was economically diverse. So I worked with young people and their families from very wealthy backgrounds and others from very poor backgrounds. And so for me, whatever the population, I'm always looking at the whole person and the communities, the families that they come from. Now, I can't say that was an easy task in a local church youth pastor capacity, but I think a lot of it depends on the mission and the vision of the local church and how that is lived out. I think in some of my local church experiences, they have been very much so embracing my sort of broad way of looking at love and how love is lived out in the earth. And in other contexts, they've needed a little more practice in kind of seeing that particular vision. But I have to agree with Anne. I've enjoyed both contexts of working in the local church and working outside as a chaplain. I think my community chaplaincy piece, if there's one piece I have to highlight, is oftentimes many churches, many local churches, many parishes have people in the pews who don't know what their role is. They can't find their fit. And in working as a community chaplain, I was able to tap into those people that exist in every congregation to say, well, maybe your calling and your fit is to do more service outside of the four walls of the church. And so I love the diversity of chaplaincy and what that affords.
So I could spend the entirety of my day already surrounded by people who identify as Christian. I run the Massachusetts Council of Churches. I do some interfaith work, but my primary constituency for my main context of ministry is with folks who already self-identify as religious. What is like the great gift to me of being connected to the cycling community here and the transit justice advocates is these are people who do not care that I am the very important, very executive director of the Massachusetts Council of Churches. My credibility among the cyclists comes because I ride, and I ride with them. I will forever remember, I have a clergy license plate like Anne has for the her vehicle to go to fire sites, but I zip tied it to my bicycle. So I thought that was really funny. What I've learned is that it makes me really visible, and that my congregation of cyclists only primarily gathers when there's been trauma. I think that's the part that's really different for me than from life in a local congregation. Like there are a few times that we gather in joy. We didn't have a blessing of the bicycles last year because I had gotten sick and I heard about it, which was exciting and surprising to me. But mostly we gather when there's been an act of violence. And I am visible. I am visible in my city because of my public role with Mass Council of Churches, but also because I ride my bicycle, and when you're on a bicycle, you are visible to the city, and my bicycle is really identifiable because it says clergy. And so I'm riding down the street after the Boston Marathon bombing, where we did a lot of very professional community chaplaincy work, and a guy shouts from a street corner, "Hey, Pastor Everett!" I didn't know who he was. But he knew me, and my bicycle and my ministry was visible to him. It's a very outward facing world. That's so different than the very formal, very structured gathering with the heads of church that I do the rest of the time. It is the great blessing and honor of my life. In part because it's a reality check on the insularity of the church for me.
It's funny you mentioned that because of just the nature of the community, you almost only ever gather at moments of trauma. So if I think about that as kind of one extreme, on the other hand, LeSette is working at a college campus, which hopefully most days, not a lot of trauma going on there. And then Anne, you're with firefighters on a regular basis. Sometimes there's trauma, sometimes there's not. Is there a difference between trauma chaplaincy and chaplaincy for people that are just, LeSette, that you see in the dining hall? Is that different?
So once again, I think it depends on your context. For me, 96% of our student population here at Berea College are Pell Grant eligible. All of our students, approximately 76% or so, come from the Appalachian region. And so the majority of the students that I work with here have experienced some form of trauma. And so I really do see my experiences in trauma-informed ministry as very relevant here with the population that I'm working with. As a college chaplain, with that population being primary, I work very closely with our counseling center. Our brand of pastoral care and counseling here on this campus is very much so trauma informed. Our on-call processes as college chaplains mean that we spend a good deal of time in the hospital with students, et cetera, because given the majority of students come from poverty here, we know that poverty brings with it health disparities, physical health disparities, mental health disparities, et cetera. And so for me on this campus, having a trauma-informed approach to ministry is critical. It's critical.
Well, and a question just popped up in Q&A, and this is a great time to sort of bring it in. And this person says that she would love to hear you, specifically LeSette, she would love to hear you talk about the path to becoming a community disaster response chaplain. You mentioned the various bombings and shootings and all these things that are happening. What was your path there beyond sort of, a very traditional formal board certification as a chaplain? What can you do if that is something that appeals to you? This is a really practical question, so I think useful.
Yeah, I think there is more and more attention being paid now to the need for community chaplaincy and disaster response chaplaincy. And so there are many pathways. For me, what informed my service there was in the day before September 11th, September 10th, 2001, my mother was shot in Philadelphia. And so that informed my work in violence prevention. And it was through that work that people began to gravitate towards me, sort of as Laura mentioned, kind of saying, hey, minister, help us, And so that was really where I began to see the need to have additional trainings, because most seminary programs, or at least MDiv, Masters of Divinity programs, don't really prepare you for that. So I looked for partnerships between the seminary that I was studying at and other institutions that provided a disaster response focus. And so what I came upon in about 2002, 2003, was a group called the International Fellowship of Chaplains. And they had some experience in disaster response chaplaincy, and they were an organization that traveled throughout the nation doing community-focused trainings and helping people go through a process of becoming ordained and or certified in disaster response chaplaincy, helping faith communities understand that there are certain FEMA trainings that are free and that are offered and that are required when you're responding to a specific disaster, that as disaster response chaplains, we more so have an open door and connection to be able to respond to those critical incidents. When we have our critical incident stress management, debriefing, all of those disaster response trainings that are necessary, me as the local church youth minister, I'm not going to be allowed on that disaster scene. But if I have a relationship in advance, for Boston, it was the city of Boston, the Department of Public Health, and specifically their trauma response team, that the relationship was built with. So they knew, okay, we have this group of people who have capacity has been built. And so what I did was I coordinated really the dispatch of the chaplains when there are critical incidents like that. And so in short, partnership with an organization that specializes in disaster response chaplaincy. For me, it was the International Fellowship of Chaplains. Also did some work with Billy Graham Rapid Responders. Also worked with the Red Cross, the Salvation Army. So there are many pathways. It's just partnering with those who are doing that work and getting the certifications that are needed.
Sure. That makes me think that I have this assumption in my mind, and I hope to be corrected. But my assumption, and this is directed at Anne, is that you're stepping into a very old institution, both with the fire department itself and clergy being affiliated with the fire department. But I'm guessing that there's not a whole lot of specialized training for how to provide chaplaincy to firefighters in particular, or in general, just, emergency responders in general. So how did you become a good fire chaplain is what I'm getting at.
That's a good question. Yeah, there's not a lot of official training that I had done, certainly in advance. I did a 2-day class that the New York Interfaith Disaster Services had that was in disaster chaplaincy. I'm sure that there are other agencies that are a part of that network that offer this training. It was a helpful training. It was not life-alteringly helpful.
Good.
I would say in my case, the best training I actually got was by serving a neighborhood that's very working class in nature and now is transitioning like quickly in terms of gentrifying.
Yeah.
A neighborhood in which I didn't really resemble most of the people I served. That I would see like a lot of the folks as either being like not necessarily speaking the same language, not necessarily like not having the same political views. And also I think just learning how to love people and like accepting them for who they are. So some of the things that I've done, like in order to do that, I also think we have to get to a point where we can love ourselves. So I did a lot of like spiritual maturity growth work on myself, to get to the point where it isn't all about me and I can be present with people and they can make their own choices. And I'm not so invested in like making them. One of the things that Laura said that I think was really interesting, and I wanted to go and circle around to, and this might work quite well, is the part about your clergy sign on your bike and how that made a difference. You were like, yeah, a clergy sign like Anne has on my car. In full disclosure, I tend to have a very unmarked car for fear that I might like cut somebody off in New York traffic. And like, God forbid they should like associate that with the FDNY chaplain. So I live in deep fear of in some ways being visible, right? Which also I've had like a series of bad karma overall with my vehicle. So it's always like kind of being banged up. And I kind of cower because you don't want to have a banged up vehicle like looking really down in the tooth and be representing like the fire department. But where the visibility in my experience has made a huge difference is actually the benefit of putting on a uniform. In my own life, it can separate when I'm working from when I'm not working. It makes me highly visible in a community. And I hadn't quite realized, Reverend Wright had spoken about the importance of building partnerships. And like in a crisis, people don't reach out to people they don't know. They reach out to the people they have encountered, like they know, right? Like their partners, you know, there are lots of different words we could use to describe them, but you go to the people you know. And in fact, what you don't want are the people that you don't know and you don't have a relationship with in most cases. Like there's nothing worse than like somebody who flies in and, you know, drops in for the disaster and then like takes off. You go with your partners. And so I hadn't realized that one of the primary tools for my ministry within the fire department is actually putting on this sweatshirt over this clerical collar. No, it's actually one of the gifts of a uniform. Like you can actually tell who most people are and what they do by what's on their shirt, where they function. And I've also been really surprised at what it's meant to the people outside the fire department. So one of the ways I feel very blessed to be somebody who receives a lot of Michael Judge stories. Like he was an institution throughout New York and I basically collect them. I'm the repository in some ways because I wear this uniform that people will stop me and tell me a Michael Judge story that happened to them because they associate us both with the uniform. And that's an incredible gift. Like I had a colleague who said, when people share a story about Michael, listen, because that's how he's teaching you the job from the other side of the grave. And how significant that piece of advice is because he did the job so incredibly well. And that's why people stopped to tell me these things. So there are moments I think where being visible and identifiable is such a key aspect of the job. And like when a disaster really does happen, anybody, like no matter what you're training, if somebody is desperate for a chaplain, they're going to look for their own chaplain and the person wearing it. And I would hope that I would be able to respond as the best chaplain possible for them. because it can be such a key moment, you know? So like, I imagine that the day that your mother was shot, like the persons who you were able to interact with made a huge impact in your life. And you want to prepare yourself to be that person when the time is at hand.
You know, I'm going to take a moment just to ask a question out of my own curiosity. You were talking just now about Michael Judge, and if people in the audience don't know who that was, Michael Judge was chaplain to the Fire Department of New York, and then also the first official casualty on 9/11. And we can sort of gather from that what he was doing in that day, being a chaplain, you know, to the fire department, and also operating priest. That was where he would have gone sort of naturally, being who he was. But what does it mean to be a fire chaplain? What do you do? Fortunately, you know, out of all the emergency responders, firefighters tend to have, I don't know, they could probably assume a little bit more safety on a regular basis than maybe a police officer or something like that. So I'm wondering, what does it mean to be a fire chaplain? What do you actually do on a day-to-day basis?
When my son was in kindergarten, there was a large explosion in the East Village, and I had just gotten on the job, and a friend of his mom ended up taking care of him so that I could go and respond to that gas explosion. And the next day I was picking up the two kids from school, and I could hear the friend asking my son, like, so what is it that your mother actually does? And his brilliant response out of the mouth of a kindergartner was, she prays that there's water in the hoses. And I don't know why, sometimes I really feel like that is like just about sums it up. Like it is a little more tricky to actually say, like, day in and day out what we do. I mean, at that fire, it was the first time where I discovered that, like, here I am brand new. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm desperately trying to not get in the way of anything. And a guy comes up to me and just starts talking almost like nonsensically. And it turned out that he had been in the building searching for someone. It was his very first fire, like real fire. And he could feel the wall give way, and he didn't know how he got out. And he was just in complete shock. And it was a moment where I felt incredibly useful, just to be present with him and remind him, like, be like, you're okay, you're alive, you're okay, you're out, we don't know how it happened. Talking about, like, that it had been a long time since he was in church. But it was a moment where, like, that seemed really useful. There are many other times where I almost feel like my job is to stand around feeling awkward, and not exactly knowing what to do or how to be useful. And I think getting comfortable with that sort of, like, well, I don't really know what I'm supposed to do here. I'm just here.
She's always come back in a few seconds. I hope that it comes through again.
Hey, Anne, it's Laura. I also, knowing your ministry as I do, my experience also is you've got a ceremonial ministry now, with the number of funerals you're doing following the way that cancer has affected those who were serving in FDNY during 9/11, and in the days after. I wonder, well, maybe when Anne comes back, if she, Anne, did you hear me try to prompt you on that?
No, that was so great, though. I could feel your intention in the first 3 words you said, and then I disappeared. I'm so sorry.
Not at all. Hey, friend, talk about your ceremonial role.
Oh, right.
Because I think one of the things, you've got a ministry of presence and, like, going to the firehouse, hanging out, making sure you're known and credible, and, like, can shoot it with the guys, and that you've got a growing ceremonial function in doing the funerals of those who are now dying of cancer following 9/11.
Yeah, so the fire service in general loves a good ceremony. I mean, everywhere around. They actually have liturgies. I mean, you can think about them like liturgies. And in the FDNY, every ceremony is open with a benediction or open with an invocation and closed with benediction. And it's an amazing opportunity to have a minute. Really, that's what it is, to frame the job or the ceremony, and to make meaning of that work. And then, so we're in a season of many funerals of people who are dying of cancer related to their work at the World Trade Center. On average, we have somebody who dies about every other week. And then on the year anniversary, so we participate in the wake, in the funeral, and then on the year anniversary of their death, there's a plaque dedication that happens at their firehouse or EMS station. And so all of that, there's a chaplain assigned for each of those events. So there's a lot of grieving related events, kind of, which I thought was interesting, Laura, when you talked about how your community gathers for trauma, and how you were reminded that you didn't do a bike blessing. I'm discovering like similar things, that like we have some joy-filled ceremonies, but trying to make sure that we can frame meaning about the joy amidst the sorrow is, I think, a really significant role that we get to have. I often will think like, wow, all of these people are here for whatever the ceremony is. Yesterday we had promotions. We promoted maybe 60 people. And you know, the whole top brass is there from the fire department. And I'm like, if you calculated up the number of hours at probably their hourly rate, this is a very expensive ceremony for all of us to be here for. I wonder if that's a good investment of our government resources. And I've come to, like, I know I just admitted that in front of all these people. I'm the bravest, right? That's the bravest. So what's interesting though, is it gives the ceremonies give such meaning to the work that I actually think that the fire department and the FDNY has an incredibly high level of commitment. And the number of people who will say, I have the best job on earth. Like, I have the best job in the world. This is the best. We really do think that we have the greatest job in the world. Even on our worst days, people will say, but I have such a great job. And I think the reason why we're able to do that is because we're constantly being reminded of the meaning of the work. So that even though we get together far more often when someone dies than we do to celebrate our victories, that meaning making, which really is the work of a chaplain, like the spiritual meaning making, I'll often say that like we are the hands and feet of God, because when people call 911, that is an urgent prayer, the most urgent prayer. And whether or not we believe in a divine presence or an act of God or whatever, the fact that like you call 911, the people who are sent to respond are the people who are answering that prayer. So like we really answer prayer. That's just like one example of kind of the frame, my talk about, you know, like what we do in terms of framing. And I think the same thing with you, Laura, is like, if you're constantly getting together for sad things, how can you pivot to celebrate and, you know, make the daily activities have meaning?
And you mentioned that sort of the expectation or the norm for where you are is that for ceremony, you start with invocation, you end with benediction. That's very old school. Laura, I'm wondering, you had said that because you gather typically around trauma, that means you also typically gather for ritual of some sort. And in so many settings, chaplaincy has moved away from ritual because that's just not what people are looking for anymore in many cases. So I'm going to ask what sounds like a challenging question, although it's not. It's just sort of a hypothetical. But, you know, you go to one of these dedication ceremonies for a ghost bike, for example, and you do your chaplain thing. You lead this commemoration. Some would say, some do say, I'm not one of them, but some do say, why does that need to be a chaplain? So the question is, what does a chaplain bring to that sort of setting that, insert in the other title, doesn't?
Yeah, thank you. It's a really interesting question. I mean, I sort of got drafted because, so let me give you a little history. Ghost Bikes began in St. Louis in 2000. They were essentially an art installation of a guy who felt like there had been a lot of transit violence. People had been killed in his neighborhood. He was a bike mechanic. He took a bunch of old beater bikes, painted them white, put them up in high crash areas. And the police took them down 24 hours later. But it became an act of defiance. And so the way Ghost Bikes started in St. Louis, moved to Pittsburgh, then moved to New York, and have become a global act was really a protest. What has become different in Boston is our relationship with our elected and civic officials have changed. I'd say part of that, so it's not combative, it's not secretive. Sometimes it's defiance, but usually I'm coordinating with police and media and elected officials and the families of the deceased. I continue to be a little surprised that this group of people whose primary cohesive identity is the daily practice of riding bicycles, of how they commute, right? Like, this is how people get around, have entrusted me with the sacred responsibility of remembering the dead. What stuns me every time I do a Ghost Bike dedication is that the people, in a local church, the people who come to a funeral generally know the dead person. When I do a Ghost Bike dedication, hundreds of people come who do not know the person who died. There's a sense of communal identity that happens. I want to say also in Boston, the way we do the Ghost Bikes is there's a volunteer group of about, on the books, 100 people, in practice about 20. It's not just me, but I'm probably the most public face of it. And I think folks entrust this to me because I know, as a trained Christian pastor, how to lead ritual. And this has stretched me. I can't use, in this community, it stretched me. I cannot use explicitly Christian language. We started off, when I first began this, by saying that we were praying together. I've learned that that was alienating for a lot of my folks. So we have now a litany of grief and gratitude in our liturgy. And the call and response is not, hear our prayer. It's now, we need each other, we need each other. So I've had to do some stretching. As a Christian, that sometimes makes me feel a little like I'm pastoring with one hand tied behind my back. And it's been a poetic challenge for me to find language that makes meaning for the broadest range of people. And people who are somewhat defiantly non-religious. And yeah, what the cyclists show me is that they are devout. They are devout. My God, they're devout. And what we do together is commemorate the dead. That feels like an ancient sacred practice of funerary guilds. And I think they've shown that it matters that I am a religious person. Because they keep asking me to do their weddings and the Ghost Bikes, right? And so I think my credibility, like, I'm not an official appointee in the ways that Reverend Wright and Reverend Kansfield are. I am communally acknowledged. I know there are a couple of people who don't love the work I do, but for the most part, the cyclists, my credibility comes from my community.
True.
You've earned it.
Did that answer that, Michael?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Well,
Yeah.
Laura, I think that there's a big difference. So the Ghost Bikes in New York are based out of my church in Brooklyn.
Sure.
And they come, they make the Ghost Bike installations. We've held, we had a funeral for a woman who was killed. I think there's a huge difference though. I am not the chaplain of the Ghost Bike community because I am terrified of biking in New York City, and I would never bike in New York. And I think that like sense of like being one of them is huge, right? So, and that like the reason why people come is not because they knew the person, but because there's a shared identity, which is also very similar in the fire department. Like thousands of people will show up for a funeral, whether or not they knew the person who was deceased, and will grieve in ways that like you would be very surprised that they didn't know the person because there's such a high identity. So like the identity of being an FDNY member is really high. The identity of being a biker who commutes as a biker, I think, especially because it's dangerous, is a very significant identity. They're not going to go and look to somebody who isn't a biker who doesn't understand that.
Yeah, I would disagree that biking is dangerous, but
sorry.
So actually, Reverend Wright, I'm wondering, how do you think about your own experience, right? Like, where does your credibility come from, having experienced trauma yourself and in your work or your relationship with your students? Where is your particularity as someone whose credibility also comes from within the community?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was still chuckling about whether biking is dangerous or not. So I'm really resonating with my work with survivors of murder victims. And so, you know, really the sacred spaces, these are sacred spaces that we are, you know, discussing. And I think about the memorials that develop in communities within the city when someone is murdered, the memorials that develop after critical incidents like Columbine, like Parkland, Sandy Hook, Boston Marathon. These are sacred spaces in which chaplains as spiritual first responders really do look at the ritual aspect of what we're trained in, but we do that in the realm of respect of what the community is sharing with us that they need. And so my experience has been, I always look to the community for guidance versus coming in and you know, having this template of what needs to happen. And so I was struck by that as I listened to both Laura and Ann, the significance of memorials as sacred spaces and the litanies that you're doing. I also wanted to mention here on a college campus, and I've also seen this in working with first responders and also being a chaplain to chaplains who serve in the military and other places, that suicide is also very significant in all of these communities, all of these populations. And a similar type of sacred space memorial gathering. What I do here as a college chaplain, because suicides are increasing amongst the college population, we've had, you know, those situations here at Berea and other campuses that I've served on. And so we also develop those sacred spaces here on the college campus. So I'm seeing like the synergy and the different ways that we serve and how we, you know, really honor life and really hear from the community, informing us as to what they need for healing. Now, I don't know that that gets at the question you asked me, but I just wanted to share that. My personal experience, here's the connection. I earn the right to be heard, okay? Whether I'm working with youth or whether I'm working with survivors of murder victims, when they learn that I am a survivor as well, that interaction feels very different. Even here on a college campus, I am a first generation. I was a first generation college student. I work with the majority first generation college students here. And so that is a way also that I earned the right to be heard with this community. And so that piece that both of you are discussing is significant for chaplains.
Yeah, that's so helpful for me. And I mean, there's a leadership role in this too, right? Because I think about your wisdom about looking to the community for what's needed. When I first started doing the Ghost Bike ceremonies, we gathered to dedicate the Ghost Bike, and I put my hands on the Ghost Bike, and we sort of acknowledge it together. And what I noticed after that ceremony was when Gene Leonard was killed, was that his peers went and touched the Ghost Bike afterwards. And what I noticed was that the community built the ritual that I had missed. And so from then on, what we do is, we bless it together. I still use language of blessing. We bless it together. I put my hands on it, and we ask to put our hands on somebody else's shoulder and build with our bodies the web of connection that we all need to stay alive. And then we bless it. And then I say at the end, as you leave, please go and bless it yourself. And so to give people ritual that, I'd say the other thing that where I've been leading rather than just like doing what the community wants is, we sing every time we gather. And what I've heard from people, and that's a stretch, because please, if there are hymn writers among you on the call, write some things that we can use for communal grief that can be sung in interfaith and sacred and secular settings, for the love of God. But what we've learned to do is sing a cappella together, and we've built some muscle memory, because people need a tune to get stuck in them, that they can hold on to as we go from that place. So my people would not sing were it not me saying, so we're gonna sing because we need something to echo through us when we lose the words. We're gonna sing bold and brave as if our lives depend on it, because it does. We're gonna sing because there's breath in our lungs to honor the one who no longer is among us. And then, I've got like 3 songs we do. But that's sort of, I'm teaching and building capacity in that as we go.
So much of everything that all 3 of you have explained is either learning by experience, touch and go, just you found yourselves in these situations, and so you had to figure it out. What we, and by we I mean sort of the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab and the broader community around it, are thinking about a lot is education for chaplaincy. For someone who might be at the beginning of their career or discerning this type of vocation, if they want to pursue, if they know I want to be a chaplain, or they think that they want to be a chaplain, what could theological education in the more traditional institutions, the historic paths to spiritual leadership, what could they do to acknowledge this and embrace it and in some way foster it for the future? I want to be mindful of time, so I'm going to throw that out there as the last question, but I would love to know what you think about that.
So I'm currently working with the American Baptist Churches USA on that specific question, because what I've learned is that there are a lot of people who feel called to chaplaincy who we may consider second career. So they're not interested in going back for a master's degree to go through the traditional pathway into chaplaincy that we know of. And so I think definitely we have to be open to other pathways, more non-traditional pathways into chaplaincy, skill building, capacity building, giving folks the tools that they need, and really working in partnership, interdisciplinary partnerships within cities, within organizations, wherever the chaplaincy need is, to make sure you have those many voices around the table and that capacity is being built to serve.
Shadow someone who's doing it. So because I'm in this like weird ad hoc communally, I want to also say, like, there's not a financial model for what I'm doing right now. The reason it works is because I have a full-time ministry position, and that pays my healthcare, that gives me the capacity to give time to the community of cyclists. And I do it in a way that intentionally models that for the churches that I work with, where I say, like, hey, what are you doing that is outward facing? So there is a logic to it. But shadow, so what we've come up against, there are pretty regular fatalities. The more credibility that I have among the cyclists, the more I'm being asked to, I visited someone's mom in the hospital. One of the cyclists, his mom's dying. And he said, "You're the closest thing I have to a pastor." What is not clear to me is, what do we do when I'm on vacation or I'm sick? We're doing some intentional shadowing here with a couple of other pastors who are cyclists, so that we've got a deep bench. But also, if this is of interest, follow someone for a day or a week who's doing this. Yeah.
I would say be as intentional as you can about finding places, communities, groups that you're not like, and that you are like, and practice reading the community for what the spiritual needs might be. Both like area, because I think that like the ability for people to identify with you, like Reverend Wright, the fact that you're first generation, like I was thinking to myself as a student, I'm like, well, I'd love to go and talk to her. Like she, like the ways that people need to have some way of identifying in order to feel like a safe connection is significant. And being comfortable with the fact that like sometimes people are not going to identify with you. Like obviously, if I have a predisposed disposition to not knowing how to bike in an urban environment, and or having my own personal fears around it, like it is no wonder that I am not doing Reverend Everett's ministry. And I mean, getting in touch with our own selves and where God's light shines in our lives, I think, and where things work and where things don't work, and kind of like a river finds its way down, like you'll find your way into those spaces, but like practicing feeling awkward, practicing not having an answer, practicing not knowing anything, practicing messing up. Like I feel like all those things would be good practice.
Well, on that very hopeful note of go out there and just be awkward and make lots of mistakes, and you'll be a good chaplain at the end of the day. We're gonna take that as our takeaway lesson. Thank all three of you for joining us today and for sharing your experiences and your wisdom. I'll remind everyone that the webinars are recorded, and so once we can sort of go through them quickly and cut off the beginning and the end where we're talking and get them up on the internet. We put them there so you can enjoy them later or send them to people that you think might be interested. Thank you all very much. LeSette Wright, college chaplain at Berea College, Reverend Laura Everett, who is the executive director of the Mass Council of Churches, but also the bicycle chaplain in Boston, and Reverend Ann Kansfield of the Fire Department of New York. Thank you all, and have a wonderful afternoon, everybody. Bye-bye.